They burned herbs, soaked cloth in vinegar, and prayed to saints. In an age before science, before sanitation, and before women had a voice, their bodies still bled. But how did they cope when even talking about it could be seen as a sin? This is not just a story about periods. It's about what happened when biology met ignorance, shame, religion, and survival, and what it reveals about the lives of half the medieval population, lives we rarely hear about. In medieval Europe, menstruation was not a subject for open discussion. It was a source of anxiety, judgment, and silence. Female biology was seen not as natural, but as suspicious. When women bled, it wasn't understood through science or anatomy. It was interpreted through theology, superstition, and fear. The church played a defining role in shaping how society viewed the female body. Menstruation was often framed as a punishment thief's legacy to all women. The influential 12th century theologian Peter Lombard wrote that women were forbidden from entering churches or receiving communion while menstruating. He wasn't alone. Many church authorities echoed this idea, declaring that menstrual blood was unclean and spiritually contaminating. A woman who bled was considered impure not because of her biology, but because of inherited sin. This belief filtered down into daily life. In rural villages and towns alike, menstruating women were discouraged from baking bread, milking cows, or preparing preserved foods. It was thought their presence might spoil the milk, ruin fermenting beer, or kill crops simply by walking through a field. These weren't fringe ideas. They were woven into everyday behavior, passed down not as theory, but as practical caution. Some of the earliest recorded medical texts reinforce this fear. The Tritula, a popular 12th century compendium of women's medicine originating in Salerno, did attempt to address menstruation, but it too operated under flawed assumptions. It suggested that menstrual flow was the body's way of purging toxic humors, a concept inherited from ancient Greek medicine. Galenic theory, which dominated medieval medical thinking, held that women's bodies were naturally colder and wetter, less perfect than men's. Menstruation was a visible sign of this imbalance. It made women seem medically unstable, unpredictable, and physically inferior. The Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder, whose works were still referenced in medieval texts, claimed menstrual blood could blunt steel, dim mirrors, and even drive dogs mad. Even though Pliny had died over a millennium earlier, his ideas were treated as fact in many learned circles. When medical and religious authorities agree on misconceptions, myths become reality. Cultural shame followed women into private life. They often lacked safe, clean ways to manage their periods, but were expected to hide every trace of it. In monastic settings, menstruating nuns were sometimes required to sleep separately, or excused from certain religious duties, but not always. Out of compassion, it was seen as necessary to maintain ritual purity, not to protect the individual. Most troubling is what isn't found. Diaries, letters, and chronicles from the time rarely mention menstruation. Even though half the population experienced it, silence became a form of control. What wasn't spoken about could be marginalized, reduced to rumor, or dismissed altogether. The medieval world's view of menstruation reveals how power, belief, and ignorance can shape bodily experience. Women's blood wasn't just seen as inconvenient, it was treated as dangerous. And in a society ruled by male clerics and scholars, that view persisted for centuries in medieval Europe. Menstruation was not just a private matter, it was a daily challenge made more difficult by limited resources, public scrutiny, and the absence of anything remotely resembling modern hygiene products. There were no pads, no tampons, and certainly no discreet solutions. Most women had only what they could make or repurpose, and even that depended on status, wealth, and location. For noble women, resources were somewhat more accessible, softened. Linen rags were most common, often folded and secured between the legs using strips of cloth tied around the waist. Some used specially sewn garments or underlayers to hold absorbent fabric in place. But even for the upper classes, menstrual management was far from comfortable. These cloths had to be washed, dried, and reused often in open courtyards or public washing areas. Privacy was a luxury, and any visible stain risked social embarrassment or judgment. Peasant women had fewer options. Linen was expensive, and fabric was precious. Many used scraps from worn-out clothing. Others resorted to natural materials, dried moss, bundles of straw, even sheep's wool wrapped in old fabric. In colder regions, peat or animal fur might be pressed into use. These solutions were far from effective. Absorbency varied. Leaks were common, and without undergarments, most women wore only tunics or gowns. There was often little to hold anything in place. In some cases, especially among the poorest, women used nothing at all. They simply bled into their clothing. In villages, it was not unusual for older women to train younger girls on how to adjust their posture or sit in a way that minimized visible stains. Long skirts helped conceal the worst of it. But it was not hygienic, and it was certainly not comfortable. Cleaning these makeshift materials presented another problem. In towns, women often washed soiled cloths in communal rivers or streams places, where others drew drinking water or washed food. This was not just unsanitary, it was often frowned upon. Some regions imposed restrictions on when and where women could clean bloodied cloth, associating it with impurity or bad luck. If stained garments were left out to dry, they could invite gossip or ridicule. So, many hid them under beds, behind cooking pots, or inside chimneys to dry without being seen. Hygiene was poor across all classes. There was limited understanding of infection or bacteria. Vaginal irritation, sores, and even sepsis could occur from repeated use of unclean fabric. There are scattered references in medical texts to women suffering from womb fevers or mysterious inflammations, many of which were likely caused by unsanitary menstrual practices. Add to this, the pain, cramping, was not well understood. It was rarely treated. Some women used herbal remedies such as mugwort, rue, or fennel to dull the discomfort. But many simply endured it, quietly, without complaint. Pain was expected. Managing it wasn't. Yet none of this was widely recorded, because menstruation was not spoken about. It was something women handled in silence. In castle halls and village huts alike, they bled, cleaned, and carried on hidden beneath layers of cloth, beneath social shame, and beneath the noise of a world that barely acknowledged they existed. In medieval Europe, the Church did not simply influence society, it defined the boundaries of what was seen as clean, holy, and acceptable. And when it came to women's bodies, especially menstruation, those boundaries were rigid, moralized, and deeply rooted in theology from the early centuries of Christianity. Menstruation was framed not as a natural biological process, but as a sign of spiritual impurity. The foundational texts of the Church, including writings by influential figures such as St. Augustine and St. Jerome, reinforced the idea that a woman's bleeding was linked to original sin, Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden. This theological backdrop shaped how women were treated for centuries. According to Leviticus 15, a text frequently referenced in Christian teaching, a menstruating woman was considered unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touched her became unclean until evening. Although Leviticus was part of the Old Testament, its influence persisted into medieval canon law. In practice, many clergy taught that menstruating women should not enter churches, receive communion, or handle sacred objects. Some even extended the prohibition to reading the Bible or participating in any religious function during their cycle. This wasn't just a spiritual theory, it was reflected in legal and social restrictions. In 7th century England, the penitentials manuals used by priests to assign punishments for sins included explicit references to menstruation. Women who had sexual relations during menstruation and their male partners were often told to fast or abstain from communion for several days. The Penitential of Theodore, attributed to the Archbishop of Canterbury, imposed a 7-day penance for intercourse with a menstruating woman. Monastic rules echoed the same sentiment. Some orders barred menstruating nuns from receiving the Eucharist or participating in communal worship. In 12th century France, the abbess Hildegard of Bingen herself, a respected theologian, acknowledged in her writings that menstruation was part of the natural cycle, yet even she upheld the idea that it rendered a woman spiritually impure during that time. The association between menstruation and sin went beyond individual conduct. It reinforced broader gender hierarchies. The idea that women were physically and morally weaker justified excluding them from the priesthood, sacred rituals, and positions of spiritual authority. It wasn't only about blood, it was about control. Even childbirth, another biological function, was tainted by this thinking. Women who gave birth were often subject to a ritual of churching, a rite of purification before they could return to church services. This too stemmed from the belief that bodily fluids made a woman temporarily unfit for holy spaces. Over time, regional variations emerged. In parts of Eastern Europe, folk Christianity blended local superstitions with church doctrine, further stigmatizing menstruation. Some communities believed that a menstruating woman could cause wine to sour or crops to fail. In others, women were told not to look into mirrors or bake bread during their cycle. The Church's stance on menstruation was not simply about doctrine. It shaped how women saw themselves and how society treated them. Their natural cycles became a marker of spiritual failure, reminder that their bodies were never fully clean in the eyes of the divine. And through centuries of repetition, that belief became deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of Europe. In a world where public discussion of menstruation was discouraged, and medical knowledge was dominated by men who neither experienced nor understood it, women turned to each other. Across medieval Europe, an informal, often invisible network of midwives, healers, and elder women carried centuries of practical knowledge. They were not formally trained. They had no degrees, but they knew how to ease a birth, soothe a cramp, treat an infection, and manage the monthly pain that society refused to acknowledge. Midwives were at the center of this underground system. Their role extended far beyond childbirth. In many villages, they served as the closest thing to a general practitioner for women. They tracked bleeding patterns, diagnosed irregularities, prepared herbal remedies, and taught younger women how to care for themselves in private. This knowledge was passed orally from mother to daughter, from midwife to apprentice. There were no textbooks. The instruction came through observation, ritual, and lived experience. In cities like Paris, Florence, or Cologne, guilds and licensing, eventually regulated some midwifery work, especially by the 13th and 14th centuries. But in rural areas, the practice remained informal. It was women's medicine, shaped by need and adapted by time. Remedies often included locally available plant smugwort to encourage menstruation, yarrow to control bleeding, chamomile or fennel for cramps. Recipes varied from region to region, depending on what was available and which traditions survived. Herbalists and so-called wise women operated in a grey space, sometimes respected, sometimes feared. Their knowledge of the female body made them useful, but also suspect. As tensions between folk medicine and church doctrine intensified in the late Middle Ages, especially after the 15th century, these women increasingly found themselves accused of witchcraft. The line between healer and heretic blurred. The Malleus Maleficarum, written by Heinrich Kramer in 1487, cast suspicion on female healers. It claimed witches could use menstruation in their spells, and suggested that women who knew too much about the body were dangerous. This marked a turning point. What had once been tolerated or, at least overlooked now, risked persecution. But despite the growing risk, the network continued. In kitchens, behind closed doors, in shared moments by village wells, women asked questions they couldn't ask men. They shared remedies that couldn't be found in a monastery scriptorium. They kept track of cycles using small stones, stitches on cloth, or notches in wooden beams. In some households, a piece of red thread tied discreetly on a spindle marked the beginning of a cycle and internal code passed between generations. Not all of it worked. Much of the knowledge was flawed or limited, but it was theirs. And in an age when official medicine rarely prioritized women's suffering, these support systems provided relief, privacy, and a sense of control. They were built out of necessity. They survived through secrecy, and they tell a story not just of struggle, but of quiet resilience. When institutions failed to care for women, women cared for each other. Medieval medicine was built on ancient foundations, chiefly the theories of Hippocrates and Galen, filtered through centuries of commentary by Arab, Latin, and Christian scholars. But when it came to understanding the female body, especially menstruation, these theories turned guesswork into doctrine, and male physicians, operating without anatomy or lived experience, relied more on philosophy and speculation than evidence. One of the most enduring ideas came from Hippocrates, who believed the human body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant balance, illness, imbalance. Menstrual blood, according to this model, was seen as a way for women's bodies to purge excess. Galen reinforced this in the 2nd century CE, writing that women naturally had an excess of blood due to their cooler and moister constitution. Menstruation, therefore, was a necessary release. If it stopped, illness would follow. This theory persisted well into the 14th and 15th centuries, but the interpretations became stranger. Some medieval physicians believed that if a woman did not bleed regularly, her womb would become overheated or engorged with toxic blood. This could lead to suffocation, hysteria, or madness. Others blamed menstrual irregularity for diseases in both sexes. One widely copied medical text, De Secretis Mulierum, attributed to Albertus Magnus, claimed that menstrual blood was so toxic it could wither crops, tarnish mirrors, or cause dogs to go rabid if they licked it. Another idea, dating back to Aristotle, suggested that the womb could physically move around the body, known as the wandering womb theory. It held that a displaced uterus could block airways, press on organs, and cause choking, hysteria, or sudden death. Treatments included fumigation of the vagina with strong-smelling herbs, either to lure the womb back into place or drive it away from vital organs. None of this was grounded in anatomical study. Human dissection was rare and, in many cases, forbidden by religious authorities until the later Middle Ages. Most doctors relied on animal dissection or inherited texts by the 13th century. Medicine was increasingly professionalized, particularly in university centers like Salerno, Bologna, and Paris. But these were Melanie institutions. Women's health remained a secondary topic, usually addressed in sections on reproduction or disease. Trotula of Salerno, a rare exception, authored a compilation known as the Trotula, which offered more practical advice on menstruation and childbirth. But even her work was reattributed to male authors in later centuries to preserve male academic authority. Treatments prescribed by male physicians were often crude. Bloodletting was recommended to rebalance humors, even in menstruating. Women, pessaries soaked in vinegar or wine might be inserted to induce bleeding. In some cases, strong purgatives or emetics were used to force the body into expelling whatever was believed to be trapped. Pain, discomfort, and complications were common but rarely questioned. In truth, most male doctors had little understanding of menstruation. Their theories often reflected broader anxieties about the female body, viewing it as unstable, impure, and inherently inferior. Their writings reinforced religious taboos, justified social restrictions, and perpetuated harmful myths. While women quietly managed their cycles with practical experience and communal knowledge, official medicine stood apart, isolated in libraries, misinformed by dogma, and confident in its authority. It would take centuries before medical science began to correct these errors. In the medieval period, misinformation didn't just persist, it shaped how half the population was treated, controlled, and misunderstood. In medieval Europe, class wasn't just a matter of comfort, it defined how a woman experienced her own body. Menstruation, already burdened by taboo and silence, was shaped by access, by privacy, by money. While noble women and peasant women both bled, their realities were divided by walls of stone, by linen veils, and by the reach of running water. Inside a noble household, a woman had physical space. Many castles had private or semi-private chambers, where a lady could retreat. In some larger estates, access to warm water and basic sanitation was available, at least by medieval standards. Wealthier women often used finely woven linen cloths, tailored to fit and sometimes perfumed to mask odor. These cloths were laundered by servants, dried in less visible areas of the estate, and stored away discreetly. Privacy was preserved, not just by walls, but by staff trained to maintain discretion. Some noblewomen even had access to rudimentary undergarments, long shifts with drawstring belts that helped secure menstrual cloths. In Italy, France, and parts of England, inventories of elite households occasionally mention monthly cloths or similar garments. They were handmade, expensive, and reusable, but wealth didn't shield them from stigma. Noble women were still bound by church laws. They, too, were considered ritually impure during menstruation and were expected to avoid the Eucharist or certain religious spaces during that time. Even in the upper classes, menstruation remained a hidden ordeal, managed with more comfort but not more openness. For peasant women, the conditions were entirely different. They lived in cramped, single-room dwellings, shared with family, livestock, and little else. Water came from communal wells or nearby rivers, often far from home and shared by dozens. There was no linen to spare for monthly bleeding. Cloth was patched and repurposed, and old rags were used until they disintegrated. In many cases, there was nothing to use at all. Peasant women often bled directly into their clothing, relying on long tunics and the absorbency of layered wool or coarse fabric. Stains were difficult to hide. Washing soiled garments took time, effort, and a walk to the nearest streamware. Others might be washing food or collecting drinking water. It was not uncommon for women to be scolded or shamed for washing bloodied cloth in public view. The physical burden was compounded by labor. While noblewomen could afford to rest, at least for a few days, peasant women worked through their cycles. Fieldwork, hauling water, grinding grain, or tending animals didn't pause for pain. Cramps, infections, or heavy bleeding were dealt with quietly, sometimes with herbs gathered from the forest or passed down by elder women in the village. The class divide also meant a difference in knowledge. Noble women had occasional access to trained midwives or court physicians, though many still held outdated beliefs. Poorer women relied on folk remedies and communal wisdom, often more practical but lacking formal recognition. Menstruation didn't respect wealth, but wealth shaped how women managed it. In castles, it was concealed behind tapestries. In huts, it was endured without protection. Across class lines, the silence remained. But the tools, the treatment, and the dignity granted to each woman were never the same in medieval Europe. Menstrual blood wasn't just misunderstood, it was feared, mythologized, and weaponized in the cultural imagination. It existed at the intersection of sex, fertility, and superstition. For a society with limited scientific understanding and heavy religious oversight, menstruation became a vessel for all kinds of beliefs, some symbolic, some dangerous, and many contradictory. Fertility was at the heart of it. In a world where childbirth was fraught with risk and infant mortality was high, the ability to conceive was a woman's primary societal value. Menstruation was understood, in vague terms, as a sign of reproductive health. A regular cycle suggested a woman was fertile. But beyond that, the process was deeply unsettling to many medieval thinkers. The visible presence of blood without injury violated expectations. It had no clear cause, no clear explanation, and no male equivalent. This ambiguity allowed superstition to flourish. In rural France, Italy, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, it was commonly believed that menstrual blood could rot grain stores, curdle milk, or cause hailstorms if a bleeding woman walked through a vineyard. In agricultural communities, this belief had economic consequences. Women were banned from harvesting certain crops or entering wine cellars during their cycle, not by law, but by long-standing local custom. In some parts of Central Europe, people believed a woman who burned her menstrual cloth could bring misfortune on an entire household. Others thought that blood from the first period could be used in love potions or curses. In England, records from the 13th and 14th centuries show accusations of using menstrual blood in so-called beneficium, a term covering both witchcraft and poisoning. The fear wasn't just symbolic, it was practical, and it shaped behavior. The contradictions were everywhere. While some believed menstrual blood was toxic, others believed it held power. Folk healers in parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans claimed that mixing dried menstrual blood into food could increase a man's virility or secure his loyalty. Recipes for this kind of magic, sometimes called binding spells, survived in trial records from witch hunts well into the 16th century. These practices weren't widespread, but they were real enough to be documented in court cases, confessions, and ecclesiastical investigations. Sexuality was also caught in the web. The Church taught that sex during menstruation was a sin. The Decretum Graciani, a 12th century legal text that influenced canon law across Europe, labeled such acts as unnatural and worthy of penance. Yet some medical authors argued the opposite. That intercourse during menstruation could help release stagnant blood and improve a woman's health. This split between theology and pseudo-medicine created confusion that persisted for centuries. The result was a landscape shaped by fear, contradiction, and moral judgment. Periods were seen as a sign of fertility, but the blood itself was viewed as dangerous. Women were expected to bear children, yet their most basic biological processes were treated as unclean or even threatening. And because the male establishment, medical and legal, couldn't fully understand it, it became easier to treat menstruation not as a function of nature, but as a source of superstition. What bled in silence also bled in suspicion. In the medieval world, a missed period brought fear, not curiosity, not convenience, but real consequences. There was no scientific understanding of ovulation, no reliable tracking, and no pregnancy tests. When bleeding stopped, women and those around them were left to guess. Was it conception, disease, or punishment? Menstruation was erratic even under normal circumstances. Poor nutrition, stress, or physical labor could alter a cycle. But any disruption was interpreted through the lens of religion, morality, or fate. A delay sparked concern. An unexplained absence could lead to suspicion. In communities where fertility was closely monitored, especially among unmarried women, missed period often carried more than biological weight. In towns and villages, reputation mattered. Virginity before marriage was not just a moral expectation. It was a social contract. A woman seen as impure risked losing any chance of a respectable match. If a period failed to arrive and whispers began, the consequences could be immediate. Public shame, broken engagements, in some cases, exile from a household. The suspicion alone, without proof, could damage a family's standing. Unmarried pregnancy was more than a scandal. It was a legal and religious crisis. Ecclesiastical courts across Europe routinely prosecuted cases of fornication, adultery, and bastardy. A woman unable to explain her condition might be dragged before a bishop's tribunal, forced to confess, or face excommunication. In some jurisdictions, civil penalties followed. In 13th century England, illegitimate children were barred from inheriting property. Their mothers, meanwhile, could be placed under public penance, paraded through churchyards, or subjected to extended fasting. Within marriage, the situation was different but no less stressful. A missed period could signal hope or danger. For noble families, especially those seeking heirs, the stakes were high. A pregnancy might secure a line of succession or threaten one. Among peasants, more children meant more mouths to feed. In times of famine or war, a late period could inspire dread, not celebration. Without diagnostic tools, women turned to signs, changes in appetite, nausea, swelling, but all were unreliable. Some midwives claimed to detect pregnancy through pulse changes or urine inspection, but these methods were crude and inconsistent. Others relied on superstition, dropping oil in water, or asking a woman to hold her breath while lying on her back. None offered certainty. In rare cases, miscarriages were mistaken for delayed menstruation, further confusing the experience. And when bleeding resumed after weeks of absence, it raised new fears: a failed pregnancy, divine intervention, or punishment for sin. The line between medicine and morality blurred, with women caught in the middle. The silence surrounding menstruation made it harder to ask questions, share concerns, or prepare for outcomes. In a time when knowledge was scarce and judgment swift, a missed period wasn't just a private matter. It was a moment of risks, social, physical, and emotional, and every woman who lived through it did so without answers. The medieval record is filled with sermons, legal rulings, chronicles, and medical theories, nearly all written by men. Kings were documented, battles preserved, the movement of stars tracked. But when it came to the daily physical experience of half the population, the pages fall silent. Menstruation, despite being a regular part of life for every woman, is almost entirely absent from the mainstream historical archive. This wasn't accidental. It was structural. Literacy in the medieval period was concentrated in monasteries, universities, and court bureaucracies, spaces overwhelmingly controlled by men. The people writing history didn't menstruate, and they didn't see it as relevant. Even female-authored material was rare. Nuns wrote devotional texts, saints' lives, and occasional letters, but they rarely described the realities of the body. Bound by the same religious taboos and expectations of modesty, what survives comes in fragments. Scattered references in medical manuals, monastic regulations outlining when women could attend mass, penitentials detailing the sinfulness of sex during a woman's unclean days. The Trotula collection, attributed to the female physician Trota of Salerno, is one of the few surviving sources that directly addressed menstruation with clinical detail. But even that text was edited, translated, and often reattributed to male authors in later centuries. Outside the medical sphere, menstrual references appear only when they intersected with men's concerns: ritual purity, sexual restrictions, or legal implications of pregnancy. The absence of personal writing from medieval women, especially among the lower classes, means we have no journals, no first-hand accounts, no testimony of what it felt like to manage menstruation in silence. This erasure wasn't just about gender, it was about power. The people shaping the written record decided what was worthy of preservation. Blood on the battlefield was worth recording. Blood in private was not. The silence still lingers, making these histories harder to reconstruct, more important to recover. In medieval Europe, a woman's life was shaped by limitations. She didn't choose religious codes, social roles, and a medical system that misunderstood her body. Menstruation, though constant and defining, was rarely acknowledged publicly. There were no products, no sanitation, no supportive infrastructure, only silence. There was no privacy, whether in the cramped, single-room cottages of peasants or the stone halls of nobility. There were few safe spaces. Women worked, walked, and worshipped while managing bleeding with linen scraps, wool, or nothing at all. They navigated shame, hid stains, and endured pain while performing the same daily labor expected of them. Regardless of their condition, they were told by physicians that their bleeding was a toxic purge. They were told by the church that it marked them unclean. They were told by custom to stay quiet and disappear. And so they did, quietly developing methods, sharing remedies, and creating support systems in the spaces between authority. Midwives, herbalists, and elder women passed down practical knowledge, rarely written, always remembered. What made this survival remarkable was not just the physical endurance, but the emotional and social resilience. For a peasant girl accused of promiscuity after a late period, or a noblewoman forced into seclusion for bleeding at the wrong time, menstruation could alter status, reputation, and marriage prospects. There was no medical relief, no guarantee of understanding, only the consequences of being seen as impure or improper. Despite this, women persisted. Across regions, across centuries, they adapted. They managed bleeding while harvesting grain, while walking miles to fetch water, while bearing and raising children. There are no monuments to this work, no chronicles of their daily adjustments, but their survival laid the foundation for the generations that followed. The historical record may have excluded their stories, but their experience was not erased, it was inherited. In the modern world, menstruation still carries a residue of that silence. It remains underrepresented in education, stigmatized in public discourse, and, in many places, surrounded by myths not so different from those written centuries ago. To be a woman then meant managing biology under pressure from religion, from medicine, from culture. It meant enduring discomfort without recognition. It meant being strong in ways that history chose not to record. But the silence of the past is not proof of absence. It is only proof of what was ignored. And that silence, once examined, tells its own story.